to exact greater performance from our workforce. And that's why this topic today is so relevant for me. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get into everything. We should have time for questions at the end of our session, but don't wait till the end to ask them, right? As a question arises, go ahead and pop it in the chat. Those kind people at Texas SHRM are helping me by monitoring the chat today. We might stop to talk about your question in the moment, or we might pause it for later in the presentation. Just know I want to answer all the questions. And if by chance we run out of time, I'll email a response to you. So make sure that we capture those questions as soon as one comes to mind. One more thing, we're recording the session. So after today, you'll receive a link to the recording from Texas SHRM should you want to review the conversation again. One more thing. The SHRM recertification info, which I know we're all interested in, that's going to come at the very end. So you got to stay connected. And I can't think of anything else. So let's just go ahead and kick off the combo, okay? We're here to talk about COVID-19 and its impact on women in the workplace. I'm just going to dump some interesting stats on you. 4 times as many women as men dropped out of the labor force just last September, right? Roughly 865,000 women compared to 216,000 men. Yes, that's a 1-month figure. And it was validation of the predictions regarding the impact of COVID-19 on women and the accompanying childcare and school crises. We were told it was going to be severe, and it has indeed. You know, last summer, way back, I think around July, the Washington Post featured an article, and they called it "Coronavirus Childcare Crisis Will Set Women Back a Generation." And in that article, they pointed out that 1 out of every 4 women who reported becoming unemployed during the pandemic, and that was just a few months into the pandemic, really, right? But 1 out of every 4 at that time who reported becoming unemployed during the pandemic said it was because of a lack of childcare, and that was twice the rate among men. And then the very next month, in August of 2020, CNN ran a headline, "Working mothers are quitting to take care of their kids, and the U.S. job market may never be the same." You know, when we think of these high unemployment numbers that we started to see in 2020 and have followed us into 2021, we tend to think of layoffs and furloughs, right? That's where our heads go to first. But those are only part of the picture, right? Because many women are leaving the workforce, not because their jobs vanished, but because their support systems have. They're calling it a she-session instead of a recession, right? And in a year marked by crisis and uncertainty, this she-session has landed corporate America at a real crossroads, right? We have choices to make as HR professionals representing our organizations. And those choices that we make today are going to have consequences on gender equality for really for decades. We're going to start with poll. How about that? So I want to ask you to just let me know if you've noticed in your workforce if the effects of COVID-19 have impacted your female workforce differently from your male employees. I just want you to be able to tell me yes or no. And then if you don't mind, in the chat, kind of elaborate for me. Tell me some ways in which you've noticed these differences. So there's the poll for you. I'll give you just a little bit of time to respond, but go ahead and in the chat, let us know what you're seeing out there. Okay, so we're seeing some divergent opinions here. Give you just a couple of more seconds, and then we'll close this poll. Let's go ahead and close the poll and see what our results are. So yes, so it's apparent to you as well as the rest of the world, right? That we're going through a very different time for women. And as Sarah says, and so many folks have mentioned before, that disparity really has a lot to do with the school closures, the daycare issues, those kinds of responsibilities that overtime have usually fallen on women to take care of in the home. You know, I think Laura mentioned something that because her workforce has many single moms, that they've had to get kind of creative with some flexible options, because as a single mom can't afford to lose their job because of these things, but are looking to their employer for some new ideas of how to handle these differences. So thank you for your participation there. I think it's been, you know, I think it just validates what it is that we're all seeing, right? You know, because 2020, our workplace is turned upside down in a hot minute, right? I like to say that the future of work showed up like all in one day, and that was around March 13th, I think, last year. But under all the challenges of the COVID-19 crisis, men, women alike, many employees are just struggling to do their jobs. You know, a lot of us feel like we're always on because that boundary between work and home has blurred, right? We're worried about our family's health. We're worried about our family's finances. Burnout's a real issue, but women in particular have been negatively impacted. Women, and especially women of color, are more likely to have been laid off or furloughed during the COVID-19 crisis, which is going to result in stalling their careers, jeopardizing their financial security. And to the point that we've already made aloud, the pandemic has also intensified challenges that women always had in the workplace. Working mothers have always worked a double shift, right? Full day of work followed by hours spent caring for the children, doing that household labor. And now the supports that made that possible for women, that they could even do those double shifts, that school, that childcare, those things have been upended for women. And as a result, 1 in 4 women are contemplating what many would have considered unthinkable less than a year ago: downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce altogether. Again, it's a critical moment for us in corporate America. We risk losing women in leadership and our future women leaders, and unwinding years of painstaking progress that we've made toward gender diversity. But, you know, in every crisis, there's the obvious downside, the cons, but there's also an opportunity, right? Because if we can begin to make the investments in building a more flexible, a more empathetic workplace, we can retain these employees that have been most impacted by the crisis today. And we can create even more opportunities for women to succeed in the long term. You know, between 2015 and 2020, we made some slow but very steady progress in women's representation in the workforce. Literally in January of 2020, we were celebrating the fact that women were nearly 50% of the workforce. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is built off of statistics from McKinsey & Company. They've been doing a survey of folks in the workforce, men and women, and their lives, working men and women's lives. They partnered recently too with the Lean In group, Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, her initiative, but they've been taking a look back since about 2015 at the working lives of men and women. And so at the beginning of 2020, it was time to take another look at the stats for them. And so in the beginning of 2020, this was pre-COVID, they saw that the representation of women in corporate America was trending in the right direction. Most pronounced, amazingly, in senior management. Between 2015 and 2020, the share of women grew to 28% in SVP roles and to 21% in the C-suite. But I mean, that's great. Hey, celebrate. We've been making strides, right? But we're still dramatically underrepresented, as most people would agree, and particularly women of color. But the numbers, again, we're slowly improving. We've already started to kind of shift the conversation from that breaking the glass ceiling kind of conversation to now talking about the broken rung. And that broken rung is still a major barrier, pandemic notwithstanding. In 2020, for the 6th year in a row, women continued to lose ground at that very first step up to manager. For every 100 men promoted to manager, only about 85 women were promoted. And that gap was even larger for other women. Only about 58 Black women, 71 Latinas were promoted. And as a result, we remain significantly outnumbered in the entry-level management, okay? Just holding about 38% of manager-level positions while men held 62%. And you can see, just think about that. If we don't get to that first rung, how are we ever going to move on up to the C-suite, right? And then enter COVID-19. Could erase all the gains that we've made, right? With all of the folks taking a leave of absence or leaving the workforce altogether, all in 1 year's time, the count is up to about 2 million over the course of time, over 2020. And that's just in 1 year, right? And then about another 275,000 are estimated to have left in January of this year. Here's another interesting phenomenon. It's the first time that we've seen signs of women leaving the workforce at higher rates than men. In the previous 6 years that McKinsey's been doing their study, women and men left their companies at similar rates. And it's the first time since 1948 that we've had double-digit women's unemployment. And that exodus in 48, you guys all know what was happening around that time. That was post-war, right? People who had gone into the workforce as the males went off to war, the women who went into the workforce decided to return back to the home. So all this to say, if our women feel forced to leave our workforce, we're going to end up with far fewer women in leadership, far fewer women on track to be future leaders. And again, all the progress we've seen is going to be erased. And I just have this graphic up here to kind of show you that while men and women tend to start the career in basically equal numbers, you can see what happens next, right? I find all this kind of stuff. I can be a bit of a geek. I'm not really so much of a numbers person unless I can see it in pretty pictures like this. And it really kind of spells it out for me to understand just the depth and breadth of the situation that we find ourselves in. The pandemic, it's a health crisis, it's a financial crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's turned people's lives, it's turned our workplaces upside down. A lot of us are exhausted, a lot of us are burned out. And as it continues to wear on, right? Aren't we having the 1 year anniversary pretty soon of the 14 days to slow the spread, right? And as it continues to wear on, more and more people join that, get on the struggle bus, if you will. It's been extremely difficult. There's a lot of challenges, and several of them are pretty large, right? We've talked about the childcare, we've talked about the homeschooling responsibilities. We haven't really mentioned the mental health picture, right? And some of that created by burnout and other significant factors that are part of the COVID life, if you will. Again, some of us feel like we have to always be on. We can't figure out when we're supposed to shut down our computers and our phones and our email systems and our IMs and all that sort of stuff. We feel like we have to be available for work at all hours of the day. And still yet, as we continue to work through this, you've got people worried about layoffs and furloughs and that financial insecurity. Taken together, it really is a picture of a workforce that's really dealing with unsustainable pressure and anxiety, right? Almost half of employees that have been surveyed say that they consistently feel stressed at work, and about a third of them report being absolutely exhausted or burned out. And for working parents, working mothers in particular, those burdens are even heavier. So we're going to launch yet another poll for you. I want to know what you are thinking about the women in your workplace. What do you think that they're feeling right now? And feel free to pick all of them, none of them, whatever. But go ahead and submit what you think are some of the things that are the feels of the women in your workplace. I'll give you just a couple of minutes to respond. and it'll give me a chance to drink a cup of coffee. So let's close the poll so we can see what everybody said. I'm anxious to see. So stress, definitely. And I bet you all of us on the call feel that all of the time, right? That sense of stress and that exhaustion that I keep talking about and burned out. You know, I think that a really interesting stat on here is the number of folks who think that their staff, especially their women employees, are feeling uncomfortable in opening up to the challenges. So they're carrying that burden alone, right? And not really willing to talk about what's going on with them, right? They feel a little hesitant to discuss. And I think that this is pretty indicative of what McKinsey found in their research. And the bottom line is there's no one experience during COVID for any of us, right? We're all having our own unique experiences. And while it's impacted women more significantly, there's not one singular experience for women during COVID-19. But when we look across all of the data, there's two trends that stand out. One, women are having a worse experience than men. And secondly, the fact that the women aren't all having identical experiences. It appears that Black women, Latinas, Asian women, LGBTQ plus women, women with disabilities are facing very distinct challenges. And so it's important for us to understand this so that we can address those challenges correctly. I think when we take a closer look at those sorts of things that are likely to push women out of the workforce, or maybe make them want to downshift their careers, if you will, I think here's the things that we have to think about. The lack of flexibility at work, that feeling like they need to be available to work at all hours, that always on that I keep talking about. I think we need to take a look at the demands outside of work on our female population, that housework, caregiving burdens, some of those exacerbated by illnesses associated with the COVID-19. I think another stressor or another challenge that we have when we're thinking about our female population is that they carry the worry that their performance is being negatively judged because of the responsibilities that they've had during the pandemic. I think that to a large number of your comments in the poll, there's an overarching discomfort sharing the challenges that they're facing individually, sharing those with their teammates, sharing those with their managers. There's a certain number of us who feel like we're a little disconnected from work, right? Maybe it's because physically we're disconnected and doing a work from home, but we feel disconnected from the way that we've always done our work. And so it leaves us in the dark, if you will. And so many times things happen and we feel a little blindsided by the decisions that are going on at work because we're less plugged in, or we feel less plugged in. I think definitely there is a need to peel back on the feeling that many have that they're unable to bring their whole self to work, that they can't share those experiences and things that they're going through. So they feel like they have to check things at the door, and that's not healthy. The whole person comes to work, and so we need to be there to help support that entire person, not just the face of the 8 to 5, right? And although these factors hurt all employees, there are some groups of women, as I've shared, who experience the challenges at higher rates. As we saw on that last slide, things loom larger for certain groups of women. Compared with women overall, Latinas are more likely to worry about layoffs and furloughs, that financial insecurity, if you will. LGBTQ women are almost twice as likely as employees overall to cite mental health issues as one of their biggest challenges during COVID-19. And 3 other groups are facing distinct challenges, and those are mothers, senior level women, and Black women. For example, moms are more likely than fathers to worry about their performance and how their performance is being perceived, or that it's being perceived negatively due to their caregiving responsibilities. And women in senior leadership are more likely than men at the same level to feel as though they're always on. And Black women are more likely than women and men overall to feel like they can't bring their whole selves, to work. COVID-19's done a number, as we've mentioned, on moms in the workforce and could continue to push mothers out of the workforce. Decades of research has shown that women do more housework and childcare than men, right? So much so that women who are employed full-time are often said to be working that double shift, right? Now, women and mothers in particular are taking on an even heavier load. Their moms are more than 3 times as likely as fathers to be responsible for most of the housework and caregiving during the pandemic. And they're 1.5 times more likely than fathers to be spending an additional 3 hours or more per day on housework and childcare. And meanwhile, for the 1 in 5 moms who don't live with a spouse or a partner, the challenges are even greater. Unsurprisingly, single moms are much more likely than other parents to do all the housework and the childcare in their household, and also more likely to say that the financial insecurity is one of their top concerns during the pandemic. 1 of 3 moms have considered leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers because of COVID-19. Think about your own workforce. What if 1 out of 3 moms in your workforce dialed it back or left altogether? I think that given these challenges that moms face at work and at home, 2 things become as really no surprise to us. That they're considering downshifting their career or leaving altogether, and that they're thinking about it much more often than a father would, right? And really, those moms who are thinking about downshifting or leaving, they're citing childcare as a primary reason. I want you to hold on to these nuggets because we're going to do a little exercise a little bit later on, and in which some of these things could be pertinent to you in your success in working through that activity. I mentioned moms. I also mentioned women in leadership. Senior level women are under the exact same pressure, right, to perform as senior level men right now. They're expected to perform and then some, right? Very often, because of biases that have existed for many, many years, right? Women are often held to higher performance standards than men. That's science, right? As people like to say to us. But and women, by nature, are often more likely to take the blame for a failure. So when the stakes are high, like they are now, senior level women could face higher criticism, harsher judgment. And they're also nearly twice as likely to be an only. And when I use that term only, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with that, but that means they're the only one, right? They're the only woman in the room at work. And so that comes with its own challenges, right? Because women who are onlys are more likely than women who work with other women to feel pressure to work more, to experience those microaggressions. They want to work hard to approve that additional evidence of their competence, right? So not surprisingly, we have senior level women who are significantly more likely than men at the same level to feel burned out, under pressure to work more, as though they always have to be on. And they're 1.5 times more likely than senior level men to think about downshifting their role or leaving the workforce because of COVID-19. And 3 out of 4 of that group cite burnout as a main reason. But here's what we've got to take away from this. We can't afford to lose our women leaders. It's alarming for several reasons. One, the financial consequences could be significant because research has shown that company profits and performance can be close to 50% higher when women are well represented at the top. Beyond that, senior level women have a vast and very meaningful impact on a company's culture. They're more likely than senior level men to embrace those employee-friendly policies and programs and to champion racial and gender diversity. More than 50% of senior level women say they consistently are the ones to take a public stand for gender and racial equity at work, compared to about 40% of senior level men. And they're much more likely to mentor or to sponsor other women. And if they leave the workforce, women at all levels could lose their most powerful allies and their most powerful champions. We can't leave the conversation about the impact of COVID on women without spending some time talking about its impact, particularly on Black women. You know, Black women have always faced huge barriers to advancement. And so now, in addition to the heightened pressures that Black women who are mothers and senior leaders, the things that they're experiencing, they're also dealing with some distinct issues because of their race. The COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected Black people, right? And then coupled with the incidence of violence in the US over this past year, those things have exacted a very heavy emotional and mental toll on Black women. And on top of all this, when polled, many Black women don't feel supported by their managers and coworkers. Compared with their colleagues of other races and ethnicities, Black women have always had distinct and by and large worse experiences at work. They're promoted more slowly than other groups of employees and are significantly underrepresented in senior leadership. They're less likely than women of other races and ethnicities to say that their manager advocates new opportunities for them. And they tend to have fewer interactions with senior leaders, which means that they don't get that sponsorship, that advocacy that they need in order to advance. So given all those challenges, it's not surprising that Black women are less likely than employees of other races to report that they have an equal opportunity to advance at work. It's also true that Black women deal with more day-to-day bias in their workplaces. They face a wider range of microaggressions, having their judgment questioned, to hearing demeaning remarks about themselves or people like them, right? And again, that idea of the only, half of Black women are often onlys for their race. And when they're an only, they're much more likely to feel scrutinized, to feel under pressure to perform, and is as if their actions are going to positively or negatively reflect on everyone who's like them, right? They feel like they've got a responsibility to, I'm going to say something like carry that banner for their cohorts, and for that reason, they feel an increased or significant sense of pressure and of anxiety, right? I think too, all of the other things taken into effect, thinking about the social circumstances that combined with COVID-19, I think that the national crises, I guess, if you will, it really had a tremendous impact on Black women. And when you look at the studies, they're less likely to report that their manager has inquired about their workload or taken steps to ensure that their work-life needs are being met. They were likely to report, or not report, I guess, that their manager checked in on them in light of all the racial unrest over the summer, that their managers were not doing the things to foster an inclusive culture on their team. They not feeling as though they have strong allies at work. And really, one other thing that we have to talk about is that their own grief and loss. I think that they're more reluctant to share their thoughts on racial inequities. And so they feel more excluded, if you will, from those kinds of conversations. This is the group that's saying that they really struggle to be able to bring their whole selves to work. So again, I kind of share all those experiences with you to make you think, because these are serious challenges, right? It's serious that we've had 2 million leave the workforce, and we have millions of others on their heels that continue to consider downshifting their careers or leaving the workplaces. So the choices that we're going to make as companies in response to the pandemic, in response to the 2020 are going to shape our workplace for women for decades to come, for better or for worse. And women aren't the only ones who are going to suffer, right? We already talked about that, the sense of diversity within an organization and how companies that are more diverse do better. Pepperdine University has done a study, and it's been going on for like years, like 20 years or so, and finding that strong correlation between companies who have women executives and their profitability, right? And so if we leave people on the sidelines who should and would want to be part of the game, we're doing a disservice to our organizations and the future of our organizations. So now what? Well, we got two paths, right? If we recognize the scale of these problems and we do what we can to address them, we can help our employees to get through this time and maybe even reinvent the way that they work so it's more flexible, more sustainable for everyone. And if not, the consequences are going to badly hurt women, business, and then the economy as a whole. So it really requires us to sit back and to think long-term, right? To use our creativity, to show strong leadership, and really a laser focus on the value of women to our organizations, right? You know, some companies are stepping up, but many aren't really addressing the underlying causes of that stress and burnout that we've been talking about today. You know, a lot of companies have taken some important steps to support their employees during COVID-19, sharing valuable information with employees, updating them on their business financial situation and paid leave policies, and providing tools and resources to help people work remotely. I think a lot of organizations have expanded services related to mental health, counseling, enrichment programs, those sorts of things, offering training to help managers to better support their employees' mental health and well-being. But I think where we might have missed the boat is in taking steps to adjust the expectations that are probably at the root of why employees feel stressed and burned out. Because to my understanding, less than a third of all the companies across the country have really adjusted their performance review criteria to account for the challenges that were initially created by the pandemic and have had their lasting effects. So only about half of those updated their employees on, you know, how performance reviews were going to go, the productivity expectations during COVID, after COVID, into the new next, or whatever we want to call the next phase. So that means employees, especially parents, especially caregivers, are facing the choice between falling short of pre-pandemic expectations that are now possibly unrealistic, or trying to push themselves to keep up an unsustainable pace. And this is also in the midst of financial anxiety, right? I think some companies are doing good at putting the policies and programs in place that kind of ease the employees' financial stress. A lot of companies, we saw a lot of companies increase their paid leave, which is an important option for people who need some time off, but they can't afford to miss a paycheck, right? And about a third have added stipends or expanded stipends to kind of offset the costs of working from home. However, companies themselves are struggling financially, right? And so it may be impossible for them to be able to address some of the issues that employees are most concerned about, the possibility of being laid off or furloughed. You know, for companies that are struggling financially or rethinking their business altogether, it just may not be possible to reassure their employees on this front. So in order to retain employees, and particularly the women most affected by the challenges of COVID-19, McKinsey, in their study, brought out 6 key areas where companies could focus or expand their efforts. So I want to share those with you because I think they're good places for us to consider our start in how we're dealing with these things within our own organizations. Number 1 is to make work more sustainable. A sustainable pace of work, and that's what we're talking about, right? A sustainable pace of work. That's going to be essential to helping moms, senior level women, all employees facing burnout to get through the crisis, right? So we need to look at productivity and performance expectations. Those things that we set probably a year ago before COVID-19 and see, is this stuff still realistic? We may need to reset our goals, narrow our project scopes. Maybe we keep the same goals. Maybe the same goals are realistic, but maybe it means that we extend deadlines. You know, there's only a few managers that are doing this right now. I also think I've heard the term recovery days used as a creative way to kind of give employees some extra time off, COVID-19 days or recovery days. And it gives folks a chance to take a day off, a lot of times unpaid, but just the security of taking that extra day off to get themselves kind of back up to speed, ready for the next thing. You know, to get parents ready for a new semester at school or something like that. Just an opportunity to recharge maybe is what people are looking for. I also think that, you know, I very much agree with Mackenzie's thoughts that we need to kind of reset our norms around flexibility. You know, it's not going to fly anymore for us to say, nope, you got to work from the office, right? Because we all have proven, no, you don't, not necessarily. You know, clearly a lot of us have had frontline people who never missed a beat and stayed in the office or stayed frontline with the customer, with their customer population. But a significant number of us have made that move to work from home. A lot of us want to go back to the office, believe it or not. There's a huge movement that wants to come back, and there's some benefits of going back to the office. But for those of us who are at home, will probably stay at home. It's much, much harder for us to draw those clear lines between work and home, right? That we always feel like we're on. So companies owe it to their employees to reestablish kind of those work-life boundaries, you know, setting new work norms. Maybe setting, you know, times for hours for meetings, putting policies in place for responding to emails outside of typical business hours, improving communication about work hours and when people need to be available. We also need to encourage our employees to set their own boundaries, right? Take advantage of flexible work options. Even when those options are available, there's a significant number of us that worry about that there's going to be a stigma attached to using them, right? So mitigate that. Assure your employees that their performance will be measured on results, right? Not when they did it, not where they did it, or how many hours they worked to do it, but on the results themselves. And I think leaders can do a good job of communicating their support for that workplace flexibility, right? And modeling that flexibility in their own lives, which sends that message to employees that it's okay to take advantage of flexible work options. And so when I believe that my senior leaders are supportive of it, I'm much more likely to consider opting into those flexibility opportunities rather than, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Rather than downshifting my career or leaving the workforce altogether. I think too, I've already spoken to this to a certain extent, but taking a closer look at those performance reviews. You know, it's important to acknowledge all that our employees have given us during this time. But I think we need to make sure that we're working with our employees to refocus themselves on those key priorities, reassessing their performance criteria, making sure it's still attainable, that it's still realistic, it's reasonable to achieve these things. And I think if we do that, if we partner with our employees to talk about these sorts of things, I think it's ultimately going to lead to better performance and higher productivity. I think we need to take steps to minimize the gender bias that has existed and continues to exist within our workforces. The pandemic has, I think, amplified some of those biases that we faced for years as women: higher performance standards, harsher judgment for mistakes, penalties for being moms and taking advantage of flexible work options. Those biases have kind of shown up in new ways, right? You know, there's a bit of, I think there's been some grace given, but there's still a little bit of a pause, right? When you see young children playing in the background on video calls, right? You know, it makes you assume maybe they're less committed to their jobs. Or when we're looking at women in performance reviews, thinking about their childcare responsibilities, that could eke in there. And sometimes now, because we have less visibility into the day-to-day, all those assumptions that we had are probably going to creep in a little bit larger, right? Because we don't have any proof that dispels our assumptions, right? So I think that companies need to make sure that we're aware of our biases, right? Leaders need to speak publicly about these sorts of things, and maybe bias training is something that an organization could instill. I think also maybe it's a time to audit whether we're promoting and raising in fair numbers or equal numbers. Also the breakdown of layoffs and furloughs by gender, just to make sure that women and men are being treated fairly. And I think among some other conversations around the McKinsey study, that a need to adjust our policies and programs to better support employees. A lot of us work for organizations that did extend some policies, did extend some programs to specifically support employees during COVID-19. I know, for my organization, we added a number of apps for wellness and mental health support, if you will. Maybe more paid time off for providing resources for homeschooling or something like that. Really, too, not only just renegotiating some of those things, but making our employees aware of all the benefits that are available to them. There's a significant gap between what companies offer and what employees are aware of, right? A lot of us offered mental health counseling at some level pre-pandemic. Maybe our employees didn't even know that was available to them. So talk to our employees about those sorts of things. Let them know that it's available and how valuable it can be to them. Parenting resources, health checks, bereavement counseling, all those sorts of things. I think as we settle into the next normal, whatever that's going to look like, I think if we determine how to address our employees' biggest challenges and really allocate some of our resources to those programs that are seen as most valuable, it's going to help us to move past this unprecedented time, if you will. And look at those things that are important to our employees that go far enough to actually support our employees. So, and lastly, it's that communication, right? Open, frequent communication is critical, especially in a crisis. When employees are surprised by decisions that have an impact on their work, they're more likely to be unhappy in their job, right? So keep them informed. Don't leave them in the dark during these times. Regular updates, state of the business, key decisions, things that affect the employees' work and lives. Address them directly. Have those conversations about what difficult news means for the employees, but do so with empathy, right? So employees feel valued, so employees feel understood, because research has always shown that if we can have that kind of openness and understanding, it's going to reduce the anxiety and it's going to build trust among our employees. And as people are starting to come back, those of you who are already back into the room, what I would love to see happen is if you had a stellar idea, something particularly if it's something that we haven't really already talked about yet, please add that to the chat. Share that with the rest of the group. We're going to try to capture our chat so we can have these ideas, and maybe that'll come out to you with the recording. That just shares some of these brilliant ideas that you guys were able to bandy about in just a few minutes time. But I would love to hear some of the things that that you guys were talking about in those rooms. So go ahead, somebody, anybody, everybody, nobody, somebody. Because I think here's where we sit, right? I think we've had to think about fundamentally how our jobs have changed and our organizations have changed because of COVID. That whole idea of the remote work. And I went back and looked at, while you guys were gone, I went back and looked at some of the chat about, well, it's a little bit different when it's hourly employees versus salaried employees, whether they were frontline or essential workers, if you will, that had to be in the office or in the place of work. But you know, what we're finding is the majority of people who even thought that their job couldn't be performed outside of the workplace figured out a way to make it happen. 93% of companies that were surveyed say that more jobs can be performed remotely now. And I think employees have also seen the benefits of remote work too. I think several employees, or most of the employees, want to continue to work from home more often than they did before COVID-19. Not all the time, but with just some more flexibility. And I think that that's going to be a seismic change, right, in the way that we work, and having enormous implications. So it will help us to tap into larger and more diverse talent pools, right, as opposed to being limited to just this area. So we could hire the A player in Arkansas versus the A player, you know, the C player that we might have had to hire in Austin, let's say. So it does give us some benefits there, and maybe it then helps us to do some of the things to support, gives us opportunity to support our existing employees, our moms, our caregivers, our older employees, our people with disabilities. It can help us to create a culture that's going to support both in-person and remote work. And I think that it allows more people to do more different things in different places and in different ways than before. And I think perhaps that COVID helped us to think about a more empathetic workplace. And so some of those things may be falling into place now. I think we've made mental health and well-being a much higher priority since the crisis, right? And we've wanted to create these feelings of solidarity and these sorts of things. But let's look real quickly at some of the ideas that you guys have had, and I'll just try to call out a couple. Jen mentions the telehealth benefits that they added for free to their employees for mental health conversations, and just checking in. Sarah talks about just checking in with people. You know, how is your day? Letting them know that it's okay to take the breaks and to take the, to do the things that they need to do to come back more productive and better suited to complete the tasks at hand. Jessica talks about the EAP. I think a lot of us started to lean on our EAPs more than, we probably had employees who didn't even know we had EAPs, right, in the past. Right. Diana talks about trying to train people up to understand this isn't intuitive how to navigate this stuff, right? We've never been here before. That's one thing, how we've always talked about HR getting a seat at the table. Man, the collective head whip as everybody looked to HR to say, what are we supposed to do now? Well, we don't know anybody. None of us have been through this sort of thing, right? And so we all kind of did it together. But I tell you what, as HR professionals, if you don't leverage this opportunity to keep your seat at the table, that's on you, because we have been given a rare opportunity to really walk out our value to our organizations with some of these ideas. Someone from CareNet is saying that the newborns and children can come to work when the daycares are closed. We don't have a lot of time left for questions, and I know Dina had sent out like a call for questions before, and we did get one question in that I'd like to handle here on the call. If you have additional questions, don't hesitate. I'm going to put my contact information up here. Don't hesitate to reach out to me to continue this conversation. You guys know I love to talk and would love to continue this conversation. But anyway, just very, very quickly. The question that came through was, I think it's in our nature to do more without expectation of gifts and prizes, and talking about the value of women to the organization. And this person asked, it's not the expectation of gifts or prizes, it's that precious feeling of feeling valued, right? And the question was, in today's generational gap, with the groups that require the instant gratification, how do you build in that value? And I'm going to say that it comes inherently in how the younger generation looks at your company, how much effort you're putting into setting your employees up for success, right? Providing training, providing established goals and expectations, giving people all the information to get the job done, reasonable deadlines, leaders who are invested in their people's success. That's what the younger generation wants to see, right? And isn't that just what we've been talking about the whole morning, is these sorts of things? This is what we need to supply everybody with, but it's certainly, there's a hunger amongst our youngest generations to have this, you know, be very evident to them, right? They always talk about how millennials and those younger generations want frequent communication from their bosses, you know, more so than any other generation in the workforce. I have always heard, you know, for those of us in the older generations in the workforce, think about what we want for feedback, double it again, and maybe we're meeting the younger generations halfway, right? But I think we want to think, oh, it's such a drudgery, right? We've got to get out the paperwork. We've got to do all this. For them, it's the ebb and flow of conversation. It's that feedback, that check-in, that just knowing that the lines of communication are open. I think it's no longer that we're working for bosses, we're working for mentors. And that's the feeling that that generation wants to have. But we all kind of really want that, right? We all want to know that we're providing value. We all want to see that we're moving the needle. And how can we do that if we don't have a strong communication with the folks above us? So I want to thank you for your time. We're right